what is now a burning question. In epics worldwide. The Ramayana and the Mahabharata are heavily invested in the logic and the functioning modes of the jungles. From sanctuaries that hid and sheltered the heroes who have been banished or are hiding from their courts and their enemies in their cities, a space for self-discovery, as in the case of Ramayana, and the fulcrum of the action resulting in the enmity between Ajodhya and Lanka, jungles acted as contrapuntal to the voice of the city, the court, and the narrator within the tradition of orality who was always the jungle outsider and who followed these urban elites, nobility proper, into these unmapped territories. Most early literature and treatises, including the extremely postmodern and sensitive Arthashastra, that looked at the jungle as both a revenue generator as well as a place of fear and punishment, either valorized the human adventurers in the jungles or painted the denizens of the deep as a threat to human progress, development, and modernity. The long history of the jungle is beyond the scope of this presentation, but one must take a long look at human perceptions and attitudes to jungles before we come to terms like ecology, biosphere, environment, and conservation. So this is something that I don't need to read out. This is Rumila Thapar on Chanakya's Arthashastra. What you need to look at here is that even in the 3rd century BCE, the revenue generated by the forest was heavily invested upon by the state. Man's first brush with nature was with the jungle. For a long period of time, jungle and nature was conflated. Early humans were natural habitués of the jungle. Over time, the movement of humans from nomads to settler cultivators saw the first paradigm shift in the approach of humans to geographical space, property, land, and possession. Human possessions like family and domesticated animals gave rise to narration of the land, narration for the land, and narration by the land, and the beginning of the concept of home, tribe, clan, traditions, country, nations, etc. Cultural traditions were geography specific, and soon development and progress were measured in terms of distance from the jungle or movement away from jungle-like spaces. Landscape and geography of human settlements were far removed from the jungles and necessitated cutting down of trees and making the land habitable and fit for living. Soon the term jungle became associated with that which is not developed and hence not worthy of narrating, unless to use the space as a foil to highlight the heroic deeds of the protagonists in literature and folklores. Homeric use of nature, the areas associated with both Grendel the monster and his mother, as well as the dragon in Beowulf, reek of human condescension towards the jungle as a space infected with and fit for hermits, oddballs, and monsters. Kindly note that our epic heroes required monsters to establish themselves, and hence the jungles were staple requirements in the narration of heroic deeds, and dangerous animals and monsters. Homer's epics are full of dangerous and appropriately visually frightening monsters that either live in the deep jungles or the deep seas. The grand narrative of the exoticization of deep nature or deep jungles, the equivalent of the core areas of the wildlife sanctuaries in national parks worldwide today, work in tandem with the latent intent to raise, erase, and destroy those very core areas that are either infested with the animals/monsters or require human intervention to aid and abet development and enlightenment. Note that as late as the early 20th century, humans were also paraded as exotic creatures on display for the prevalently male white gaze, as in the famous case of the Belgian Congo. The lush green of the Cyclops Island in the Odyssey could easily be transposed onto the Congo, while the cannibalistic Lystragonians were also giants like the Cyclops and island dwellers. Even Scylla, the six-headed monster, is often portrayed in our feminine avatar. These sets of monsters, like a large many in Western epics, are anthropomorphic in nature, shape, and worldview. The ancient texts are also knee-deep in monsters with animal or non-humanoid shapes. But the two aforementioned Indian epics are more populated with monsters in the traditional sense of the term than their Western counterparts, and they all came from the deep jungles. Man's fascination with the jungles and the animals that lived within is primordial. Domestication and hunting for food, hide, skins, fat for illumination, teeth and bones for decorative pieces are scattered in many an archaeological dig all over the world. There are two ways of looking at man's interest in nature: symbolic, where big game hunting predominates, and industrial exploitation of natural forest-based resources that even Chanukya talks about in Arthashastra. The primal picture of exploitation of natural resources is felling of trees for timber and trawling of the deep seas for fish. Whaling still continues to this day despite numerous attempts to halt it. But the greatest full-scale exploitation of a country renowned for its jungle and hence its natural resources on an industrial scale, unheard even during the heyday of colonial expansion and post-transfer, was the Belgian Congo. Could I please ask everybody to switch off their microphones, because there's a feedback and the echo and I can't hear myself speak. Congo, one of the largest nations in Africa, is the epitome of the deep, dark jungles that Africa has been reduced to since the mid-19th century. Unlike the grassy plains of the African savanna, which is teeming with wildlife, and they include the great national parks of Serengeti and Kruger, and visually more arresting, the Congo was deep and dark and had the tropical rainforest that made travel and access to a Herculean task. But unlike the more famous areas of the south, the Congo was heavily invested with removable natural resources that the West harvested on a massively organized scale. The entire Congo region became the personal property of King Leopold II of Belgium, called the Congo Free State. I'm not going into the brutality of the regime and the overtly colonial disdain and total lack of humanity in the colonial enterprise. But one must acknowledge the fact that Congo was primarily responsible for the African imagination that infected Europe and made the deep jungles seem not only exotic and dangerous, but also immoral and godless, and hence easy to suspend natural justice and ethics. It also helped the West look the other way when natural resources were also discovered in the Congo, which necessitated investment, and hence was born a love-hate relationship that continues till this day, the legacy of colonialism. The two texts that went a long way in shaping Western notions regarding Africa, albeit through the Congo, were Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness and Georges Remy's Tintin in the Congo. One was published in 1899, the other in 1946. Conrad's text has received a lot of attention primarily after Chinua Achebe's 1975 scathing critique of imperialism and reductive representation in The Image of Africa, Racism in Conrad's Heart of Darkness. But the hidden gem is the Tintin comic. Now, it's perfectly legible to you all what Chinua Achebe has to say. I'm sure this is taught at undergraduate and postgraduate courses in colleges and universities all over the world. But I want you to have a look at this 1914 poem by this Polish-born American poet called Nicholas Wachel Lindsay, and go back to the cutting off of hands by Belgian colonizers in the Congo, which incidentally was not referred to in Heart of Darkness or in Tintin in Congo. Heart of Darkness, and I highlighted the things that I wanted to look at. The dominant image of Africa and Western imagination. Africa becomes the antithesis of Europe, therefore of civilization, the dialectics at work, and deep anxieties about the precariousness of its civilization, and to have a need for constant reassurance by comparison with Africa. But let's go back to, come to Tintin in the Congo. Sold only as a hardback and not found in any collectibles, this visual tale reveals the extent of the internalization of the jungle in Western psyche, I'm not going into the politics or representation at all, or the colonial overtone of the master-slave dialectics in Tintin in the Congo. But a look at a few pictures show the exploratory nature of the colonial white master entering the domain of knowledge and scrutiny, guns and notebooks, maps and photographs. If you look closely at the cover picture of Tintin in the Congo, you'll realize that the African landscape is only acting as a background, and the literal identity of the white man wearing a white dress, driving a car, and he's got a white dog and he's driving a car which is symbolic of Western civilization, and there's a black boy sitting right next to him and he's loaded with cameras and all. So in a way that encompasses and categorizes the context of Western colonization. I'll not go into that. It's already been done to death so many times. So the apparent self-replenishing jungles that hide multiple antelopes. So you can see the next set of pictures from the page where he keeps on shooting antelopes, and at the end he realizes that he has killed so many antelopes, but he needs only one antelope for fresh meat. The others have been left to rot. So blacks who mimic Westerners all hide the fact that the real reason behind the impetus of hunting and the spectacle of grand killing and regal posturing is that the forests hid timber and other easily procurable and transportable cash items, including ivory and rubber. The African jungle was ingrained in the Western psyche as representative of the dark continent. And you'll realize how Tintin is playing around with science, and how science, the magnifying glass, literally gets the better of an African elephant, or how he kills a gorilla, skins the gorilla, puts on the skin of the gorilla, and reference to Hanno, the context of white skin, black masks, or black skins, white masks, whatever. And you have to keep in mind that black and white masks have a totalitarian regime idea. Even today, we are all wearing black and white masks in COVID-19. So it's all part of the autotelic text at work. But almost 80 years before the scramble for Africa, the first half of the 20th century was also the period, first half of the 19th century was also the period that India saw the consolidation of the empire of the Hunt. It is a fascinating history that begins immediately after the death of Tipu Sultan at the siege of Seringapatam in 1799, that cemented the image of the tiger as that of a resisting and militant India, and the British lion versus the Indian tiger made for grand symbolism. The shikar and the hunt were double-edged in India. Borrowing heavily from the spectacle of the Mughal hunt, the British, starved for real big game back home, where the red deer was the largest land animal. These white masters in India went overboard when they realized the amount and variety of animals on offer, as well as the treasures of timber and ivory. Thousands of books, memoirs, diaries, travelogues, and fiction masquerading as facts were written between 1807 and continue till the mid-1970s, where white and brown sahibs showcased their bravado and skills, playing the inveterate white hero in a mimicry of the Victorian myth of manliness, where the white hero goes into the dark and black heart of the jungle, reference to Tintin here, and come out victorious and triumphant against all the odds of the colony, keeping the metaphorical aspidistra of superior Western and Christian technology, knowledge, and scientific scrutiny flying high. But the first proper book on hunting was the influential Oriental Field Sport by Captain Thomas Williamson, which was published in 1807, beautifully illustrated by Samuel Howitt. This book ended up mystifying the Indian jungles rather than explain and map the power of the jungles and the hunt in building up the business of the empire of profit and repression. It was this text and many others that followed that were instrumental in building up the cult and machismo of the hunt and the hunter, and were thus pivot of the centrality of the deep jungles in the empirical notion of nature in India. This nature is to be contrasted with the British romantic idea of nature, which was primarily beautiful, placid, non-threatening, rural, and bucolic, rather than the inscrutable and incomprehensible sublime jungles of Asia and Africa. The exotic space created by the colonial masters in India and Africa were a required sight, as it did a lot to bring young men and later women to these foreign shores in search of opportunity and adventure. Writings of David Livingstone, Missionary Travels 1857, and Rudyard Kipling, Jungle Book 1894, went a long way in legitimizing the jungles as the space for all natural activities. Soon nature was being subsumed into the jungles. Unlike the great outdoors of the Homeric era, where the sea played a major role, jungles were the new frontiers of the unknown and the dangerous. Soon, deep space, another area for inquiry and maybe a webinar later on, dethroned the deep jungles in the 1930s onwards as the place for cutting-edge heroism and new boundaries, culminating in the era of science fiction of the 1940s. But by the early 20th century, hunting and its corollary gave rise to the jungle as destination. What were till the late 19th century the sole arena for the uniformed services, forest and army officers and civilian administrators of the British Raj, well-heeled and well-read travelers from Europe and the United States started to arrive by the boatload at Karachi, Kolkata and Bombay en route to the Indian jungles. The jungles started to develop their philosophical and mystical space, and many Westerners domiciled in India started to locate and settle down in these beautifully scenic areas of India, which reminded them of home and the hearth. Please take a look at these pictures and you'll realize the British went a long way in sort of changing the geography of India by mimicking, representing, reproducing, replacing Indian landscape with Western landscapes. This was the beginning of the concept of the hill stations in India. From Darjeeling to Shimla, from Ooty to Kodaikanal, the white colonial preferred the rainy and cool weather of the faraway places and even invested in railways and roads and shifted the capital from Delhi during the summer to alleviate the pains of the actual Indian summer and not the metaphorical one, so plainly abused in the reiterated nonsense. All these hill stations were teeming with white colonials, and many of the hunters soon turned to keeping tabs and records of the jungle and the animal population. One must remember that the Imperial Forest Service was established as early as 1867 to keep detailed records of forest produce and monetary transactions thereof, and not conservation of animals. Following the direct tradition of Arthashastra, the forest departments in India were guardians of the rich treasures of forest produce, primarily timber, tree produce, and animal skins and ivory. Terms like ecology, conservation, and the environment were rarely heard of and looked down upon as antithetical to empire building and resource drain or resource looting of the colony, the raison d'etre of the British presence in India. I'm not going into the history of hunting because it's such a vast thing, but I'm sure you have all heard of Jim Corbett and the history of the hunt and how the tiger was placed as something which was representative of India, and killing tigers in large numbers using the pomp and the spectacle and taking photographs of white masters with the foot on the dead carcass of the tiger basically reduced India to a place of tigers where British colonials come to hunt them from top of the top of elephants. Something that you have already seen in the earlier pictures of Thomas Williamson. You can see that the elephant has been heavily used, and also you'll see that these are the first pictures of the actual jungle, something that we do not get to see in the Congo, but the Indian jungles are heavily invested here. This is not a place where it's not like the savannas of Africa where the lion can be seen from far off. This is the jungle that hides. This is the incomprehensible jungle. So which is already there. The concept of the hunt is also there, but I will now focus on something else. There were a few souls who were making a mark in the right direction towards conservation. It was Frederick Walter Champion who showed literally to the world that a keener interest in wildlife could be achieved through photography and observation than pseudo-natural history that was a camouflage for hunting. His breakthrough narrative with a tiger with a camera in Tigerland was published in 1927 and contained some of the first and best live tiger photographs ever to come out of India. Most of the tiger photographs that we had at that point of time were dead tigers who have been killed, and in some cases, in one tiger hunt, there would be carcasses of over 30 tigers. And all these were beautifully recorded, and there was this kind of a competition going on. How many tigers did you kill? Which area has got how many tigers? Which forest department has got tiger hunting blocks? So that calls for a different kind of an approach. But because we are talking about conservation here and the future of conservationism post COVID-19, we'll move on using this. Now, his magnum opus was the brilliant and absolutely groundbreaking The Jungle in Sunlight and Shadow, which was published in 1934, which was the first proper pictorial breakup of the famed Indian jungles and their inhabitants, which is still hailed as the bedrock of Indian conservation. His time and experience in the First World War led him to the camera rather than the gun when he joined the Imperial Forest Service, where he introduced camera traps and tripwires and nighttime wildlife photography, which are the bedrock of any wildlife photography today. Champion's instant success. In fact, these are the first pictures ever of sloth bear carrying her two babies on her back. Shows the maternal instinct of the sloth bear and not the dangerous animal that it's supposed to be. Or the fishing cat, which incidentally is the state animal of West Bengal. So these are the great finds of Jungle in Sunlight and Shadow, not the tiger. The tiger has been so heavily documented, mostly the dead tiger, the tiger skin, the tiger trophy. But like I told you, the first live pictures of the tiger. So this is one of the very few live pictures of the tiger taken in the jungle, which is not later off killed. And this is where the idea of intercutting cross-section of hunting and conservation come in. So Champion's instant success with these books led many other hunters, including a certain gentleman called James Edward Corbett, towards recording and capturing on films and celluloid the amazing diversity of the Indian fauna, rather than mounted as trophies on walls and clubs. Moreover, the first baby steps towards an ecological history of India were being taken. Tigers were fast disappearing from the forests of India, and were by the 1920s being reserved for the elite and creme de la creme of British Raj. I will now go on to the second section of my presentation. Thus, ironically enough, the preservation of big game, preferably tigers and leopards, for later culling by administrative and uniformed officers and civilian bureaucrats, were the first steps towards conservation in India. But the centrality of big game and deep jungles remained. All that will change in 1962 with Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. Like Champion, she worked for the US Fish and Wildlife Services, and a foray into arguably the first pioneering environmental issue book. She had already had a slow start bestseller in The Sea Around Us in 1951 that started the ball rolling for layman-friendly scientific books about the world around us, unlike the very difficult-to-read Origin of Species. But Silent Spring broke paradigm when she used the idea of long-term side effects to diagnose the groundwater poisoning by pesticides, which were heavily developed after Second World War. DDT and other everyday use chemicals and fertilizers, since termed biocides, which were being touted as miracle booster for the agriculture sector, and was part of the technology and science wave that affected a positive change in everyday lives in cities, were seriously compromised and revealed to be not only harmful to nature but also to human beings. Carson showed quite clearly, and here lies her pioneering position, that humans were only a small part of a larger chain of evolutionary system, and that humans were deeply harming the environment by putting too much emphasis on science and technology as the panacea to all evils. The matrix of connectivity and holistic approach to small problems that will have ripple effects on greater problems is exactly what deep ecology is about. The shift, democratic and revolutionary, from the central deep jungles and the evidently wild animals. The future of the planet lay now with chemical and unseen small organisms. Emphasis on chemical receptors and how quickly they bonded with the body of animals, including human beings, and the fact that in order for humans to live right, they needed to respect and protect not so glamorous animals and move away from the decidedly interesting big game and deep sea fishing into monitoring and the warehouses, factories, and the companies. So these are the three quotes that I have used. This is self-apparent. This needs a bit of delving deep into the growth of an industry, production of man-made or synthetic chemicals. In the course of developing agents of chemical warfare, some of the chemicals created in the laboratory were found to be lethal to insects. The discovery did not come by chance. Insects were widely used to test chemicals as agents of death for man. So 1962, you will find the germ, the warning of what later on we can see right now happening worldwide. And we can actually talk about how COVID-19 is basically a direct fallout of the very symptom, the very fact of that which made Rachel Carson write Silent Spring. Big industry leaders like DuPont tried hard to lobby for the quashing of the book. What set the book apart is that the markers of change, violently paradigmatic from an ecological point of view, almost bordering on the apocalyptic, that made Carson take note and connect the dots, did not include groundbreaking forays into remote corners of the world like the voyage of the HMS Beagle of Charles Darwin, nor the laboratory-based research for missing links and genetic anomalies. The clues and symptoms were boringly mundane. And before I move on to the third and my very important slide, I want you to look at the reason why Rachel Carson's Silent Spring is so very interesting. And it is this. Now, what she looked at is not going deep into the jungles. What she looked at is not going deep into the laboratory. What she looked at was the everyday mundane things that were happening right in front of our very eyes. The disappearance of the common birds which we do not and people vying with each other in the era of instant social media upload to get into the deepest part of the deep jungles. Reality TV shows often downplay the actual dangers of venturing into the deep jungles. And the myth of manliness and machismo that began in the jungles of Asia and Africa, venturing into the deep jungles. And the myth of manliness and machismo that began in the jungles of Asia and Africa in the 19th century continue unabated in jungles right next to you. Emphasis, on the other hand, should be put on watching and recording the lesser animals, as they are the real markers of any change. As apex predator, the tiger would be the last person to be affected. One of the first animals to be affected would be those animals that we see and take for granted. For example, the sparrow. The sparrow would be the marker of change. The marker of change, the change that will finally hit the tiger 50 years from now, the story right to us. What we are seeing in 2020 is something that was innovated in the 1960s, but we have of eco-conservationism in India today. Like Rachel Carson's birds at the beginning of Silent Spring, the holistic connectivity between all animals, humans included, at the heart of any reading of deep ecology. Environmental philosophy, the branch of ecology that looks at humans as part of a larger cycle of life, and not a worldview with humans as the apex predator but living in harmony with other constituents of biological life, is the bedrock behind Norwegian Arne Næss's influential 1989 text, Ecology, Community and Lifestyle, Outline of an Ecosophy. So this is the locus classicus of deep ecology. The decentering of humans, and in a way the indictment of humans in our ecological fallout, is at the root of deep ecology. Shallow ecology with a view to social and media positioning is going to harm us in the long run. Moreover, we have to give other species, the basis of speciesism now, equal rights to life and development. So this is taken from the midsection of the text. The right of all forms to live is a universal right which cannot be quantified. No single species of living being has more of this particular right to live and unfold than any other species. Until and unless we internalize this, there is no future of conservationism. Human intervention or human interventionism is detrimental to ecological balance and the continued survival of species, all species, including human species. In the present scenario, with the threat of COVID-19 looming large, deep ecology with a large-scale rethinking and realignment of our order of attitudes and approaches to ecological philosophy is the only way forward. Instead of focusing only on the deep jungles and their interesting animals, we should look to balance nature with economic approach to nature taking a backseat. Industrialization of nature, impingement of industry and economic gaze towards nature, deep jungles and human milieu, both need to be immediately stopped. state-funded destruction of Amazon rainforests and allotment of mining rights in forest areas in India are just two immediate concerns that are now being highlighted. What is being left unsaid is the little bits that we need to do to lessen our impact on the environment. We are all aware of the hundreds of ways an individual can contribute in small ways towards life enthusiasm. What you need to do is to sort of redefine wildlife. You need to have to do something which is going to affect your immediate lived-in surroundings. That is nature. That is nature today, as much as the deep jungles on which we have such a long and rich tradition. Let us build a new tradition of everyday life in harmony with nature, and do not look down upon the variety of non-glamorous life forms we are surrounded by, but not institutionally made aware of. So I'll end my paper with the quotation that you can see in front of you. Wildlife and forest management and other professions in intimate contact with nature change people's attitudes. That is what deep ecology is talking about. Intimate contact. We can't be in intimate contact with a tiger, but we can be in intimate contact with animals around us. We can take care of the tree in which 50 different kinds of species of birds make a nest. That is the kind of intimate contact that Arne Ness is talking about. That is the kind of intimate contact that Rachel Carson was talking about. There is no glamour here. Nobody will come to photograph you taking care of a crow or taking care of a tree which is right next to you and right next to the dusty road. Nobody will come to laud you, give you a prize. But that is the future. That is the only future. It is only through work, lay and understanding that a deep, enduring identification can develop. An identification deep enough to color the overall life conditions and ideology of society. That brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you, Dr. Sudipto Bushu, for delivering such wonderful lecture. I would now like to hand over this virtual space to the participants for raising their observation, for questions, answers. So I am requesting our participants, if they have any question, if they have any queries, if they have any observation, they can turn on their microphone and raise their question.
Okay, so I'll be glad to answer any and all questions as long as there's time for Shukendu, who I can see is all ready to enlighten us.
Hello.
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Yes, I have an observation which I am going to share with you, sir.
Sure.
First of all, thanks to you for such an insightful lecture. And you have talked about intimate contact with nature, and we should live in harmony with nature without going any debate or without going any destruction towards nature or deforestation. But my observation is, in the face of as our technology is advancing, and as we are facing, we are moving towards a new era of technological advancement and scientific evolution. In this era, so we face so many things in this new regime. So deforestation becomes part and parcel of our life, because we can't allow forest to remain in the same space as it were in 200 years back or something like that. But today we have to cut the trees in order to for advancement of our technology, or for as our population is also increasing. So what is your take that we can't neglect such things? We have to develop our technology. We have to live our life according to our scientific advancement. But at the same time, we can't neglect the trees also. Their importance is also there. What is your take on this? Environment, how environment will support it?
Thank you, Prashanto, for the question. Now, my take is to actually ask you to change the very definition of nature. When you think of nature, you think of forest. That was part of my my presentation. My PhD is on forests. In no way am I saying that forests are not important. No way am I saying that forests need not be cut down. What I'm saying is that what Rachel Carson has said, what Arne Naes has said, is that we need to expand and extend the definition is changing. Whenever you read the idea of living space, production of space, Henri Lefebvre of the 1940s and the 50s, or Edward Soya of the 1990s, but Edward Soya's approach to the idea of third space, where he talks about journeys into imaginary spaces and real spaces in Los Angeles, which is basically the format that we in India are following, is that the distinction between the country city will not be seen as oppositional. The country and the city will occupy similar spaces. That's why even today, if you are building a very big gated community in, say, Kolkata or Bardhaman or Bolpur, there is a law which says that you have to leave 60% of the space. So what is happening is that you are incorporating nature within the city. So over the years, maybe 50 years from now, it's already happened in certain countries in Scandinavia, is that there is not going to be a dialectical opposition between the country and the city. So you will be living in the city where trees will be planted. You will be living in communities, gated communities with very big skyscrapers will also contain right next to it ideas of trees, actual trees, where you will realize that over the years, nature will come and inhabit it. If you let a tree stay there, I can guarantee you that within a couple of years, the tree will have its own ecology, will have its own ecosystem. I can say this very clearly because we in Bolpur, we live right next to a very big abandoned rice mill, which has been closed for the last couple of years, and we could see that within the last couple of years, nature has taken over the mill, and there will absolute 6, 10, 16 lane highways where animals can cross without coming in contact with human intervention, the road, and leading to roadkill. That is the future. In no way is science and technology going to go away. What we need to do is we need to do our bit, not donate to Greenpeace, but actually plant a tree, actually nurture the birds and trees, and actually look forward to how nature is right living next to you. That is what I think I have to say about this. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. You have beautifully answered, and you have talked about that. The things which we have neglected before earlier, we should take care of the things that earlier also it has been told time and again that if we cut a tree, we need to plant 2 or 3 trees, and we have neglected time and again that, but it is high time that we should look into the matter. Thank you, sir. Thank you for your response.
Thank you.
Any other observation, ideas?
There's a question in the chat from Monisha Mohan, who says, how do you connect the concept of sacred groves in context of deep ecology? Shall I answer this?
Sure, sir. Please.
Okay, so my reaction to this is that there are 2 kinds of sacred groves. The ancient sacred groves, druidic groves, the kind of groves that you'll see in Asterix comics, the kind of sacred groves that you will find in James Fraser's The Golden Bough, are not so much ecological or natural, but rather human-oriented. So sacred groves are groves from where identities are drawn. Sacred groves are groves from where the histories and genesis of religions are drawn. Those sacred groves are very far and few in numbers, and in many cases they are now politicized. There is another concept of the sacred groves. In Bengal, we call them Griho Devota and all, and that each village, each gram has certain such areas where it's part of everyday lifestyle, where there are animist gods sharing space with actual idols of hierarchical established religion. So both kinds of sacred groves function as not so much the preservation of nature, but as the preservation of the narrative of that space. So the narrative of that village, the narrative of the identity. So those sacred groves are already protected because we as human beings, as people looking in search of identity and looking beyond the crisis of identity, we will violently protest, we'll violently protect those groves, not aware that they are connected with as much eco-conservationism as they are with religion. If only we went beyond the emphasis of our identity, emphasis of our culture, and looked at sacred groves as what they really are, which are natural groves, not sacred. So the moment you take away the sacred, it then loses its sanctity. I would say that if we could have hundreds and thousands of such sacred groves all over our cities and villages, maybe that could be one of the reasons, that could be one of the way to save ourselves. Forget about ecology, I'm talking about human survival. 30 years after the rise of deep ecology, we are no longer talking about the survival of nature. We are not talking about the survival of other species. Now we are looking at the survival of ourselves. So in order for us to survive, I think, Monisha, we need to sort of have lots of sacred groves so that our superstition or our belief or our fear or our followers or following of religion will help save our groves. Yeah, that is what I had to say.
So there are other questions also.
Okay.
In the chat box.
So please, next question.
Anamika Mahato, she has a question.
Oh, yes, I can see that. To what extent traditional knowledge system can help in the biodiversity conservation? The answer, of course, they'll help tremendously. But certain traditional knowledge systems need to be quantified. They need to be qualified. Certain traditional knowledge system already have problems with the hierarchy of certain species. Certain species that can be eaten, certain species that we do not eat, certain species that are good, certain species that are bad. So all traditional knowledge systems might not be work, but the kind of reference to the ancient groves, the kind of reference to these ancient forests, for example, one of the reasons why the tops of Mount Everest and Kanchenjunga are actually beyond the purview of human contact is that we have already located the Godhead in these jungles. So if you could go on locating Godheads in the jungles, including the Godheads of the marginal people who live in the forest, the actual forest dwellers, the actual habitué of the people who actually don't have a voice to say, they don't vote. They are the original Adivashis, but in our context, the Adivashis are actually marginal people. They are not the original inhabitants, though their grammatical, the lexicon actually tells us that they are the Adivashis. So these Adivashis, who in a way are now in our lexicon the non-developed, the underdeveloped, or the developing parts of India or people of India. So if we follow what the Adivashis have been doing for the last 400, 500 years, and theirs is an oral narrative, they don't have much to write about. If we look at the tribes that are living in our village and take at least 50% of their approach to nature, that itself will help us overturn this deficit of nature in something like less than 20 years. We need to incorporate these age-old traditional systems of approaches towards nature. But the point that I'm trying to make here is that, again, the traditional way of looking at nature in the sense of the Adivasi is that they are situated within nature, nature as in within jungle. The moment these Adivashis are shifted toward to places that we actually live in, the cities and the villages, what happens to then their traditional knowledge system? So do we adapt their traditional knowledge system to serve the interest of the city, the gram, the gonjo, the mofosshol, the village? Or do we need to sort of come up with a hybrid idea of a new traditional system? So I think that is what I have to say to Anamika. There's a question from Anonna. Don't you think we need to problematize this business of identification with other species? Don't you think identification is also a species-stick trope? For the very point of giving space to the species entails the acknowledgement that humans are not the species and cannot inhabit in the world exactly the way they do, and cannot also replace or reproduce the species. So the more judicious position would be one of detached identification. I would agree with you partly, Ananda, but that process of detached identification can come only after at least a few decades of identifying with these species. We need to sort of reorient our a hierarchy of species where the tiger and the lion and the whale come right at the top, and the chicken and the squirrel and the toad and the crow, they don't. There is always a ranking system that we are following, biblical or Indian or traditional or not. The answer is difficult for me to talk about it right now, in the sense that I don't know what the answer to this is, that giving space to the species entails the acknowledgement that humans are not the species. So the very idea of identification with the other, even within human species, is mimicking the idea that you're talking about. So every time I'm aware of a chicken or a cow, I am aware that I am not a chicken or a cow. But every time I'm aware of that person as being a girl, or that person as being Pakistani, or that person as being Norwegian, I am also aware that I am not a girl, or I am not a Pakistani, or I am not a Norwegian. So every time I'm aware of myself, even within my own species, I'm aware of the difference of orientation, difference or the inability to connect, the inability to identify with my own species. So naturally, when I'm aware of the species, my dog, I'm aware that I am not a dog. So this is the problem of a philosophical problem of episteme, I think. Are there any questions? I can't see any other question in the chat.
Priyam Sarkis said.
Okay.
Priyam Sarkis, he has a question.
Okay. So please ask your question.
Sir, this is Priyam. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Good morning, sir.
Yeah, it's still good morning, yes. Though it looks like afternoon outside. Yes.
Afternoon, yeah. Sir, my question is deep ecology a more practical everyday approach rather than something which is interlinked with spirituality, or to overhaul of our spiritual system?
I think, thank you, Priyam. See, it's difficult for us to say because deep ecology has never been practiced. Deep ecology is, at one level, it began with the idea of infusing, or the idea of ethics, the idea of philosophy. So to what extent is it possible, we really don't know, because not much work has been done. Much work has been done on looking at the taxonomy of the big cats. Much work has been done in looking at the ideas of forest. You actually have forest management courses. You have Indian Foreign Services, which is one of the first services in the world, which stretches back without any break to 1867. But even if you look at the Indian Forest Services today, you'll realize that there is a contradiction, a very, very dark and deep, like the jungles that we were talking about, contradiction, is that part of the approach to Indian forests from the Indian forest management idea is to look at the forest as a revenue generator. And at the same time, there is also that part of the forest which is looking at conservation. Now, a same set of body which is looking at exploiting the forest and looking at conservation of the forest, they don't go hand in hand. There has to be a very definite idea of demarcation of land. So there should be areas, or there should be absolute forests where there shall not be any exploitation. We will not sell our timber. We will not sell our forest produce. I know that is next to impossible. Even Kenya gives out large, that it sells its hunting rights, it sells its hunting license. So people from the United States, Asia, people from Australia, people from Europe, they come down in large numbers to Kenya. And they pay a huge amount of money to actually kill an elephant. That is called culling. So Kenya has a very popular wildlife management system, popular and successful, whereby the money that is generated by formally allowing hunters to come and kill and hence skull elephants goes back, is sent back into the conservation process. So that could be one of the ideas, that the deep ecology needs to be practiced by people. You cannot force the government to practice deep ecology. The government is not traditionally equipped to handle deep ecology. Deep ecology is individual. Deep ecology is moral. Deep ecology is ethical. Governments and institutions find it very difficult to talk about ethical or moral. They can paper Indian wildlife laws are one of the most stringent in the world, but you know very well what is actually happening in reality. So we have spent so much years, we have spent so much hours, we have spent so much papers on laws. Don't you think that we could spend a few more years in talking about ethics, morals? And that is where deep ecology hits. That is what deep ecology hints at. It hints at the individual, because the moral is very personal, whereas the legal is community. So if I'm in India, if I am an Indian citizen, I am under the purview of law. Okay.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you for the explanation.
Is there any more question?
Yes, sir. Shubhay Chakraborty.
Okay.
He has a question.
Right. Is that we have started taking interest in gardening in some way or the other? Yes, Shubhayu. A very interesting question, because the history of gardening goes back to the mid 18th century, and one of the arguments we can put forward is the rise of landscape painting, the rise of landscaping, the rise of zoological gardens, the rise of potted plants is in a way a kind of our atavistic approach towards internalizing the idea of a lack of nature. So the more I'm moving towards post-print capitalism, the more I'm moving towards industrialization, I'm moving away from the nature. I'm moving away from forests. And how do I compensate that? So I take pictures, I draw pictures of forests, I draw pictures of that of beautiful pictures of Constable and Gainsborough and Turner and all the 19th and 18th century English landscape painters. And I become very famous being a travel agent, Thomas Cook. I take people onto tours, or I, like Pope, refer to the very idea of the Twickenham Gardens. So the idea of zoological gardens, the idea of botanical gardens, the idea of landscape painting, the idea of potted plants is, in a way, the very idea of the garden, the very idea of the court garden, the garden at Versailles, the garden, the Hyde Park, the American New York Central Park, the Shalimar Bagh, the very idea of the garden that was planned by the makers of Taj Mahal across the river Jamuna, which you can see, which hasn't been completed, or the famous gardens that you come across all over the Indian landscape, is in a way this attempt by people to use the beauty of nature, tame it, contain it, control it, but not the dangerous nature of the deep jungle. So the nature that we are talking about of the garden is nature that I can control, the nature that I can contain, the nature that I can comprehend. And we all love being in control. That is also where the idea of Rachel Carson comes in, is that you don't need to be trained. You don't need to be a Darwin to read into HMS Beagle, the trips of the HMS Beagle. You don't need to go to Galapagos. You don't need to be Nicholas Copernicus. You don't need to be Galileo Galilei. You don't need to be paradigm shifters. All you need to do is build a garden. All you need to do is give potted plants. So that is how, I'm not saying potted plants are the way. I'm not saying building gardens are the way, but the attitude, the shift of approach from the idea of nature being central to the deep jungles, the jungle which is far away, the jungle which is not part of my lived in experience, to The nature which has been defined and oriented and reoriented and expanded and extended, and the nature that I am happy to live with, nature that I can contribute to. I can contribute to the garden. I can contribute to to a tree. I can contribute to the very idea of looking at nature right beyond my window, rather than looking at photographs of nature taken by professional photographers of some very beautiful place in some remote area. That nature needs to stay. I'm not saying that nature needs to be killed off. That nature is the basis. That nature needs to be built upon by our approach through the idea of deep ecology to internalizing the nature. And of course, yes, I agree with you. The interest in gardening in some way or the other is fundamental to our, what shall I say, deep-seated anxiety. We are aware that what we are doing is bad. So in a way, we have externalized that fear, that failure, that anxiety, the angst of the lack of nature. And we have all contributed to the potted plant. So every time you look at a potted plant in this very big, swanky marble and stone office on the 30th floor of the special economic zone in a big city, you realize that that is what nature has become. I'm not saying that nature is bad. Neither is Rachel Carson saying that, or is or on Nace. All that they're saying is we need to rethink and reconnect on an individual level with nature. Doesn't matter if it's a garden, but if everybody looks at the garden, and that helps us in becoming more sensitive towards the importance of nature, that will help. I think that will help. Any other question? Leaving root bridges like in Meghalaya. Yes, that is true. This is Nita's question. Yes, there are root bridges in Meghalaya, and those are bridges that have been there for many years. There are bridges that have already functioned in Burma before, when Burma was part of the Indian landscape, and there are books written about the Jaintia and the Khasi Hills, which where Meghalaya falls. There are these root bridges, bridges that help animals move from one place to the other. Tourism, influx of tourism, difficult because there are two kinds of tourism. One is intensive tourism, where you take in 50 vehicles into the forest. That kind of tourism will not help us, because in our country we are saddled with a huge population. That population cannot be incorporated into the deep jungle. Then there is a counter narrative to all that. So who are the people who get to see the deep jungles? Only the rich people, people who can afford. That has again a different kind of a context that needs to be thrashed upon. That who will give us the idea of who gets to see what kind of nature? Should people who are poor, people who are not able to access rich nature, as in Manosh, or deep into the jungles of Shimlipal. We went to Shimlipal last December. We had to stay in a very swanky place inside the forest, the only hotel that the government of Odisha has sanctioned. So we got to stay inside the core area of the jungle, and it was a very expensive proposition. Whereas every day at 6 o'clock the gates would open, and people would come in, day trippers in diesel trucks and diesel vehicles with 16 people in one vehicle. That kind of tourism will not help. But then again, that kind of tourism will also give rise to a kind of differentiation in society. So the question of tourism needs to be, what if we stop tourism for 5 years? What if tourism is restricted? What if certain areas of forests are absolutely off the tourist map? What if certain forests entirely are off the tourist map? These are things that we need to talk about. Point is that we are following examples of nations that have a minuscule percentage of our population. So that is what I have to say about this. Any more questions? Tribal's way of life is changing. Does this change will make impact? Yes, it will make an impact. The new tribal wants to be partly educated. The new tribal wants to be modernized. Our approach to tribals are very problematic. In my class, I used the example of the people living in the North Sentinel Island. So if you look at the map, if you look at the Google map of India, there is this island called the North Sentinel Island, which is sitting right below the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. And the North Sentinel Island technically belongs to India. But the North Sentinel Island is home to a primitive tribe that has been living in that island for at least 10,000 years. And no human being has ever been able to make contact with the North Sentinelese. There were attempts made in 1976. There were attempts made in 1996. There was an attempt made after the 2004 tsunami. And in all cases, they violently rejected all kinds of government of India approaches. There have been a shipwreck, and we don't know what happened to the sailors there. So the question that we have to raise is, a similar kind of project had taken place with the Ongis and the Andamanis and the Jarwas in what is now called the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. What should be the policy of the government of India with the North Sentinelese Island? Should we bring them out of the darkness? Should we tame them? Should we make them develop? Should we give them clothes? Should we give them technology? Or should we let them stay as they are? This is a moral and ethical debate that is still continuing. You can argue for both. The argument for rescuing these North Sentinelese is that they are living in a primitive structure. We need to bring them up. They should be made to come join the 21st century India. They should have internet. They should have access to Bollywood films. They should have access to Indian languages. They should have access to English. They should have access to KFC and, I don't know, mobile phones. The other argument is let them stay as they are. So this is our, in a way, I made it sound very, very racist, but this is the dilemma of intervention into nature conservationism. Any more questions? Bapin?
Yes, sir. There is a question from Priyanka Shaha.
Okay, yeah, I can see that. Could you please tell whether Christian missionaries have a role to play in the 19th century colonial discourse of the jungle? Yes, Christian missionaries do have a major role. In fact, if you read David Livingstone's book, it's called Missionary Travels. So the very idea of scramble for Africa, and the very idea of how the European nations scrambled for Africa in the 1870s, as late as the 1870s. So India has a longer history of colonization. So 1857 had happened, and 1870s we are, moving towards modernity. And Rabindranath is just a 10-year-old person and all. In the 1870s, it is as late as the 1870s that the scramble for Africa happened. And it is primarily based upon the publication of this very influential but slightly controversial book called Missionary Travels, which came out in 1857. So the very idea of 19th century discourse of the jungles comes through the missionaries. A large proportion of the writings that refer to the jungles in India, in Asia, in Africa, are written by missionaries or are written by government support systems, the soldiers, the bureaucrats, who are in a way associated with the missionaries. So missionaries play, in fact, there are, if you read the Tintin comics, there are many missionaries. For example, in The Broken Ear in South America, there is a missionary who goes around taming and teaching and educating and enlightening the black man. There's a missionary here in Tintin in the Congo as well. So if you look at the representation in Hergé, a specific reference to these two texts, the Broken Ear Tintin and the Broken Ear and Tintin in the Congo, these two missionaries play a major role. They are the conduit, they are the channel through which Western ideas go into the jungle, and jungle ideas go into the go back to Europe. So they act as a dual channel, channelizing Western ideas into the end user, who would be the jungle dweller, and giving information about the resources of the jungle dwellers back to the white homes from where the funding is coming from. So the 19th century colonizers heavily depended upon missionaries for information, missionaries for education, missionaries for what we now call lobby groups, which we call missionaries, where you're talking about influencers, the kind of influencers that you find in YouTube today, people who would influence you to buy product A rather than product B. So the missionaries were multitaskers, would be pioneers, would be the vanguard of the white presence in dark jungles of Africa and Asia. Yes, I would agree with you. Any other question?
I think so. There is no more question.
Okay. Right. Thank you, everybody, for giving me a patient listening. Shall we move on to Shukhendu's paper, Bapin?
Yes, yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you very
Thank
much.
you, everybody. Thank you, Bapin, and your colleagues at the Department of Political Science and English and the IQAC. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Welcome. Thank you, sir. So now we will move to our next speaker, Mr. Shukhendu Das. Let me introduce Professor Shukhendu Das. Mr. Shukhendu Das is an assistant professor of English, Bakura University. Formerly, he held a substantive post at the Department of English in Ramananda College, Bishnupur. He is deeply interested in continental philosophy, cultural gerontology, critical theory, post-humanism, Anthropocene studies, medical humanities. Professor Das is a visiting research fellow at the University of Wollongong, Australia. He has coordinated ICSSR sponsored international conference on Right Places All Discussing Shakespeare and the Politics of Cultural Gerontology in the Department of English, Bakura University. He has also coordinated young researchers national conference on Checking Past the Canon, New Mandarins in English, Film and Cultural Studies in the Department of English, Bakura University. So without further delay, I would like to hand over this virtual space to Mr. Shukhendu Das for delivering his talk. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Professor Sudip Pratim Basu, for your insightful lecture. So I am going to present my paper. Am I audible to you all? Hello.
Yes, sir. You are perfectly audible.
Yes,
You are perfectly audible.
The acoustics. And yes, do you see the PowerPoint over the screen?
Yes, yes.
It's quite visible, right? Hello.
Yes, it is visible.
Yes.
It is perfectly okay, sir. You can continue.
Okay. So if there is interruption, please inform me. I have titled my lecture as Thinking Planetary Crisis, Anthropocene and the Post-Human Condition. So I begin my presentation with the assumption that you know something about the Anthropocene, the age of humans, the present epoch in which we are living. So now let me begin with a question. And the question is this: who is the Anthropos in the Anthropocene? Now, in the Anthropocene, humans can no longer be considered as a biological agent of this planet. Humans have rather become a geological agent, that is telluric force of this planet, like massive volcanism, tectonics, earthquakes or super cyclones that change a human history and human experience of living in the world, are tangibly changing the functioning of the Earth system. So history perhaps never witnessed this epic confrontation between humans and Earth system before. So there is a huge transformation in terms of agentic presence, from hunter-gatherers, from biological agent to global geological force, that is geological agent. And This massive transformation has many implications. The idea that nature is a passive background to the drama of human affairs and activities is to be discarded. So I'm going to deconstruct the idea of anthropocentrism that lies at the heart of this anthropogenic global crisis. The social only understanding of human agency and condition is to be rethought. Economy, politics, government, history, culture, and society can no longer be seen as purely intra-human contracts. That means between, among, and within humans. It's not the idea is not like that. Contracts and conflicts, our understanding of them should be rematerialized. Modernity's building blocks. So what are the building blocks of modernity? Autonomy, freedom, agency, and reflectivity can no longer stand on their own grounds because the human agency have changed from biological agent to geological agents. So we need to rethink those categories: autonomy, agency, freedom, and reflexivity. And these are considered to be the pillars of modernity. Professor Clive Hamilton argues that I quote him, in the Anthropocene, social, cultural, and political orders are woven into and co-evolve with techno-natural orders of specific matter and energy flow metabolism at a global level, requiring new concepts and methods in humanities. Humanities and social sciences require a radical restructuring of their own disciplinary configurations. Now, I'm going to show why this is required, why is this urgent. So let me begin with another question, and the question is this: what does it mean to be human in the Anthropocene? Now, this is a famous, prodigious statement made by Socrates: know thyself. So it has a strong rhetorical power. One meaning is that in the Anthropocene, it means humans should be aware of their limitations. Human existence is a hubris, leading the planet to unprecedented crisis. Humans cannot be and should not be the measure of all things. Now, we know that in modernity is based on this nature-culture ontological divide. Now, in the Anthropocene age, what we find is the collapse of this nature-culture ontological divide. Jules Michelet, one of the founders of history as a professional discipline, argues that history is a record of man's crime against nature. Discourses of modernity have pictured nature existing in an antithetical relationship with society. So nature is posited against culture and vice versa, and does not have telos in its history. Nature does not have telos, means history has, society has telos, teleologically programmed, something that is heading towards end. But society is teleologically programmed towards freedom. Now, with the adoption of Anthropocene thesis, this division is no longer tenable. Now with the emergence, or with the coming of this Anthropocene era, we now have to rethink this ontological divide. We have to accept deep interconnectedness of human history and planetary history. Okay, I will discuss this later in the history section. Bruno Latour argues that it would be more profitable to think in terms of geostories or delusion becoming Earth rather than purely Earth system. Now, I'll be talking about this book because I think that this book is very important. After Nature, A Politics for the Anthropocene, written by Jedediah Purdy. Professor Purdy talking about the death of nature. So what does it mean? Professor Purdy argues that nature can no longer exist without human intervention in the Anthropocene era. And we should be aware of environmental imagination, or rather we should inculcate environmental imagination. So what is this imagination? This imagination is about how humans have seen, valued, and imagined nature, and what happens when it gets endangered. The next point he makes, that political, economical, and ecological vectors are integral to our environmental imagination. And last important point made by him, that the Anthropocene era is actually heading us, or rather, I've been forcing us to have a profound vision of post-humanist ethics. Now, this raises a number of questions, number of thought-provoking questions. The questions are this: if humans become geological agents of this planet, does it signal the end of nature and everything is turning into an assemble of Earth society, a techno-natural cyborg? Does it signal a new tendency of capitalism where ontologies are marked by a shift from entities to relations? So we should ask this question, and we should try to, seek answer of these questions. Now, how we should rethink historiography. Dipesh Chakraborty was one of the first historians to argue the need for a radical reconfiguration of history. Professor Chakraborty thinks that normally we keep two calendars separate. One is geological calendar and the other is human calendar. Okay. Geological calendar is about the history of this planet, and human calendar is the calendar of capitalism, of human activity, which remains immune to, geological calendar. This was a commonsensical thought and the, humanist tradition in the historiography. But in the wake of the Anthropocene, these separate entities of these two calendars is no longer tenable. Professor Chakraborty argues, I quote him, scholars who study human beings in relation to the crisis of climate change and other ecological problems emerging on a world scale make a distinction between the recorded history of human beings and the deep history. Recorded history refers very broadly to the 10,000 years that have passed since the invention of agriculture, but more usually to the last 4,000 years or so for which written records exist. Historians of modernity and early modernity usually move in the archives of last 400 years. The history of humans that goes beyond these years of written records constitutes what other students of human pasts, not professional historians, call deep history. Now, let me show how certain binaristic thinking should be reconsidered in philosophy. The agentive transformation from biological agent to geological agent makes us rethink humanist conception of human being. So what is the humanist conception of human being? Human being is a rational animal. We all know that. Human being is an autonomy seeking creature, and what Kant calls human being has a purposiveness. That is, human beings are necessarily world-making creatures. So Clive Hamilton argues that modernity's project of progressive self-liberation, unaffected by the constraints of nature, can no longer be justified. Anthropocene thesis calls for a reconceptualization of freedom. So what does human freedom mean? Professor Amartya Sen has written a book, Development as Freedom. So we need to rethink development and freedom at the same time. It is to be noted that any massive paradigm shift in philosophy is constructed on a new ontology. New ontology. That means a new conception of the nature of being. Peter Sloterdijk, one of the most influential philosopher of our time, Sloterdijk considers Cartesian dualism between subject and object, nature and culture. And I mean, he rejects this Cartesian dualism and calls for an ontological constitution. So what is this ontological constitution? This ontological constitution seeks to include include all beings, humans, animals, plants, and machines. The collision of human history. Now, what we find that the human history and planetary history is both are going to collide, and the collision of human history and planetary history would result in the emergence of new entities, but it would be premature to speculate its nature at this stage. Sloterdijk's Spheres trilogy. Sloterdijk has written 3 books. One is Bubbles, published in 1998, Globes, published in 1999, and Foams, published in 2004, deals with fears of coexistence that would engage with the contemporary, within quote, hyper complexities to embrace wider horizon, at once ecological and global. Humans must engage with the monstrousness of the external. Now, since the question of, inclusion of monstrosity comes, we should refer to this book, Love Your Monsters, Post-Environmentalism and the Anthropocene. This book has been edited by Michael Sullenberger and Ted Nordhaus. They are famous for promoting the idea of post-environmentalism. So what is this post-environmentalism? They have seen that in the United States, environmentalism and sustainable thinking has failed. So therefore, they have promoted this idea that we should promote post-environmentalism that would not neglect or rather discard the progress we have made so far, should not discard the use of technology. Rather, they should think of environment taking into consideration technology invented by human beings. So Bruno Latour contributed an article in this book, Love Your Monsters, Why We Must Care for Our Technologies as We Do Our Children. Latour argues, I quote him, Frankenstein lives on in the popular imagination as a cautionary tale against technology. We use the monster as an all-purpose modifier to denote technological crimes against nature. Dr. Frankenstein's crime was not that he invented a creature through some combination of hubris and high technology, but rather that he abandoned the creature itself. So Dr. Frankenstein's crime was that not that he created the monster, but rather he abandoned it. He did not take care of that creature. But our sin is not that we have created technologies, but that we have failed to love and care for them. Let Dr. Frankenstein's sin serve as a parable for political ecology. Excuse me. In this section, I shall be talking about the urgency to reconfigure existing world governance, political world order, and how the earth is becoming a political subject. Political affairs were thought all about purely intra-human contracts and conflicts. That is between and among human beings. The Anthropocene thesis makes us rethink the pre-existing political agency and democratic governance. So why is this urgent? Because the agency of human being has changed. The distinction between the subjective politics of science and economy and the subjectivist politics of culture and identity is getting blurred and exhausted. Uh, Timothy Timothy Mitchell wrote an interesting book in 2011, Carbon Democracy, How Carbon Shapes Our Democratic World Order. He denounces the denatured politics of the 20th century. Timothy Mitchell argues that a democratic political order depends on cheap fossil fuel and by default emits carbon and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere because of the short nature of electoral cycles. So now he raises a question: why can't governments fix it, solve it? Because of the short tenure of electoral cycles. Whenever a government comes to power, elected government comes to power, the government stays in power, let's say for 4 years or 5 years. Uh, Even if that government takes a strong policy decision regarding nature or regarding environmental crisis, uh, that government is not sure whether the next government who will be elected will sustain that policy. So this is the problem. Because he argues that because of the short nature of electoral cycles, an elected government fails to take any policy decision to harness greenhouse culture, which is called greenhouse culture, which requires a planning for next 5 decades, let's say for another 50 years, which no government is ready to take because there are other peer pressures and also livelihoods. Um, this exposes the limitations of parliamentary democracy. Definitely, because parliamentary democracy fails to take any decisive action. Anthropocene thesis refuses to recognize the environment as a struggle among humans about nature. The emerging green political theory in recent years has considered to include nature in its conceptual construction. Uh, since we can't undo progress and development, we have to rethink governance in terms of geopolitics, or rather of geopolitics, politics of the earth. Geopolitics would no longer deal with humans' relations of power over land and natural resources. It rather considers Earth as a political subject, which signals a new era for geopolitics. And another problem is that since the Anthropogenic climate crisis become a transboundary or rather transnational problem, no superpower can alone deal it. Thus, environment slowly crept into international relations and calls for global collaboration. Environment issue gets mixed up with other global problems, trade deals, refugee crisis, and exigencies of the Cold War. Uh, Another important aspect of, global political world order is that the connection between climate and capital is well established. Uh, Professor Deepesh Chakraborty, Slavoj Zizek, and Naomi Klein argue that climate crises have been fueled by capitalism. So capitalism is solely responsible for this, global environmental crisis. Slavoj Zizek concludes in Living in the End Times, published in 2010. I quote him: "One can solve the universal problem of the survival of human species only by first solving the particular deadlock of the capitalist mode of production." So to solve the problem of global warming or the planetary crisis, we have to first solve the problem of capitalist mode of production or other capitalism. The key, the key to the ecological crisis does not reside in ecology as such, unquote. And Naomi Klein, another relentless critic of capitalism, in her book Shock Doctrine, the rise of disaster capitalism, published in 2008, and this changes everything. Capitalism versus the climate locates capitalism as the singular phenomena responsible for the global environmental crisis. Now, uh, let me share my few observations regarding the present scenario. The COVID-induced crisis. Arundhati Roy calls that the virus COVID-19 is a portal. That means, let's see where it takes us, takes our, humanity to, where, where is our future lies. But Naomi Klein argues that future is more bleak because system will produce more divided, more xenophobic, and more racist society. And we have seen in America and in other countries, it actually exacerbates pre-existing inequalities. Even though Greta Thunberg for last 2 years has been imploring world leaders to treat climate change crisis as if it is an emergency, no one is paying any attention to her. They are patting on her head and passing meaningless resolution. So therefore, it requires early big intervention, which is absolutely uh, not visible at this present stage. And Naomi Klein talks about disaster capitalism. What is disaster capitalism? Making money by privatizing response to disaster. We see that Donald Trump is already doing this, profiteering from disaster and taking opportunity of the disaster. And we are sure that if this, lockdown continues and this disaster continues, Jeff Bezos will be trillionaire soon. And and Naomi Klein talks about shock doctrine. What is this shock doctrine? A political tactic of using states of crisis of emergency to push through a series of pro-corporate, policies that leave us more divided, less protected. We are seeing this in the midst of pandemic. This happens. Um, uh, we find that the government all over the world in many countries they have declared war on public health and public health budget and education sector, and many academicians are afraid that they may lose their job. Okay, so I think that COVID induced crisis is not heading towards any bright future. Rather, it is pushing towards a more bleak future. Dipesh Chakraborty, I have talked about him. Yes, and the last section of my article, how literature and eco-critics can engage with the problem. Now, cultural texts constitute of complex network of ideas, politics, history, practices of everyday life, social rituals, etc. Interpreting such text might help humans understand the patterning of enormous cultural transformations, such as the Anthropocene. Novels written in an era of global environmental crisis, which we call CLIFFy, climate fictions, makes us rethink received literary functions such as setting, character, time, and mode of representation. In his book, Ecology Without Nature, published in 2007, Timothy Morton argues that eco-criticism's dependence on romantic, ahistorical notion of nature and literature, Professor Sudev Pratim Basu was talking about this, makes us unfit to engage with the politics of global warming. So why is eco-criticism failing? And Timothy Clark has written another book, Eco-Criticism at the Edge. It is losing its relevance because it fails to engage with the politics of global warming. And Bruno Latour, in his book, We Have Never Been Modern, published in 1992, argues that modernity is based on ontological disjunction. I have already discussed it, disjunction between nature and culture, subject and object. Hence, modernity does never help us understand how reality works. Latour argues that nature and society cannot be seen as having antithetical relationships, And this gives us an occasion to recognize that we have never really been modern. So this is a classic statement made by Bruno Latour. We have never really been modern. Now, what can help us? Network of hybrids. This actually refers to Bruno Latour actor network theory. Latour argues networks of hybrids, that is half subject and half object, known as machine and facts, can mediate between nature and culture. Latour's model of ontological interdependence might help eco-critics to form a methodology of environmental interpretation. Cultural text should explore how things like tectonics, volcanism, viruses, supercyclones, and capital shape human experience, and condemn greenhouse culture. And finally, should engage with this question, what it means to live in the Anthropocene. Thank you for your kind patience. That's all about my presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Shukhendu Das, for your informative presentation. So the floor is open for question answer session.
Yes.
So those who want to question, please raise your questions, please, one by one. Please raise your questions.
Okay, I can see a question, sir. What do you mean by greenhouse culture? Okay, so first thing, so what do you mean by greenhouse culture? Yes, greenhouse culture means the cumulative impact of civilization on nature, and how our living condition is producing carbon and other greenhouse gases, and thereby help rising temperature in the atmosphere. This is in short called greenhouse culture, and this is produced by, this has a long history. We have to go back to industrial modernity, and also enlightened modernity is also responsible for this. And that,
Sir, also there is a question by Pradipto saying,
okay, yeah,
does human democracy
affect animal democracy? Human democracy, definitely. Human democracy, actually, existing capitalist system is governing our democratic culture in many parts of the world. So therefore, definitely human democracy is affecting animal. I don't know what does it mean by animal democracy, but I think that we are exploiting and destroying natural resources and doing harm to them. Definitely. Another question
by Chiranjit Gorai.
Chiranjit Gorai, what is the importance of geological calendar in terms of environmental history? Yes, this is a very significant question. I talked about this issue because I felt that I agree with Dipesh Chakraborty. Professor Chakraborty has written a book, the planetary crisis, global history, and or rather the environmental history or geological history, and also human history. But the question is not, it should be reformulated. What is the importance of geological calendar in terms of writing environmental history? Yes. The thing is that we should incorporate green elements into our environmental thinking, right? So green element should be reintroduced, right? A green element should be reintroduced in our existing political theories. Therefore, a sub category of political theory has emerged, which is called green political theory. So thank you for the information. Sir, could you please expound geostories? Geostories, this has been expounded by Bruno Latour. By geostories mean how the human how the human agency, the nature culture ontological divide is getting discarded, and we should think about our existence in terms of, I mean, our existing nature. That is called geostories. It is actually Bruno Latour's term, and also Bruno Latour actually argues that actor network theory can help us in formulating, I mean, a more green political theory. So what is this actor network theory? An actor network contains not merely people, but objects organization. So it is basically a shifting network of relations, which includes, which is made and remade and made between human and non-human. So we should take into account in our in the conceptual construction of green political theory the presence of the non-human, right? So that's all about geo stories. Any more question? I would be happy to answer.
Do you have any questions? Please. Okay.
Please ask.
If you have any questions, please use your microphone to ask your questions. Okay. Or write in the chat box. Professor Das is also us. Just. If you have any questions, you can ask. Or write in the chat box.
Hello, good afternoon. This is Priyam. I had a question.
Yes.
So you had mentioned how eco-criticism is failing to engage with politics of global warming.
Yes.
What would you? What is your opinion on post-colonial eco criticism? Because that tries to take into account, the inequality of global carbon economy, the way they took advantage of various resources in the colonies. And
yes,
had the
but
advantage.
that could be yes. Thank you for your, I mean, provocative question. But I think that this
Thank you,
would
sir, for taking my
this
question.
could yes, this could be the subject of I mean another lecture. It's not possible to answer this at this moment because I am dealing with mainly Anthropocene and the post-human condition. So I'm not dealing with post-colonial eco criticism. This is completely different category. Any more question?
Any more questions? Participants, you can ask questions. Any questions you can ask. The floor is open. Do you have any questions? No, sir. I think all are saying that your presentation was nice, and
Yes,
all that was.
I would like to express my deep regards to Professor Bapin Malik and other organizers of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar College, and I'm really honored to deliver my lecture here, and that's all. So,
Okay, thank you very much, sir, for your wonderful presentation. So we are very much happy to have it with us. And sir, I think there is some question. One question is from Priyanka. Please explain the idea of monsters with the reference to your work. Mention love your monsters.
Yes, could you please explain the idea of monster with reference to the work you mentioned, love your monsters? Yes, that's a good question. But I made this point while I referred to Frankenstein. Mary Shelley's book Frankenstein. My argument is that it's not our sin that we have created. Latour actually rereading Frankenstein myth. Okay, Latour argues that it's not our sin, it's not the sin of humanity or humans to create technology, but the sin precisely lies in that we fail to take care of what we have created. That means we can no longer control what we have created. So if you read Frankenstein closely, you will find that at a juncture, at a significant point, the monster says that imploring to his master that you can't abandon me at this condition. and since you have created me, you have to take care of me, right? And therefore, Dr. Frankenstein's sin could serve as a parable for political ecology. The idea is that we have to take into account both living and non-living entities together, right? Which Peter Sloterdijk called ontological constitution, right? So perhaps this is Bruno Latour is actually pointing towards this idea. I hope I have answered your question. Chiranjit Gorai has asked a question, sir, could you please repeat again what is difference between geological calendar and human calendar? Yes, this is this is a commonsensical idea. I mean, the idea actually belongs to humanist interpretation of history, right? Or rather, humanist historiography, how humanist scholar created historiography. Normally, human history is a human history actually, or human calendar. Calendar. I have used the calendar in the sense of chronology or history. Human history, human calendar, human chronology is about our activities, is about capitalism, is about making our civilization, which remains unaffected by, which remains or which are normally thought, which normally thought remain unaffected by what should I say, geological calendar. Geological calendar means what Dipesh Chakraborty calls deep history, the history of this planet, the history of the planet. I'm specifying the date. Goes, but I mean, human history actually refers to the history of written records. The written records, I mean, dates back to, let's say, last 400 years. But actually, geological history or the geological calendar is, I mean, has a long history which is not recorded. So Dipesh Chakraborty argues that in the Anthropocene era calls for calls for a rethinking of historiography. Why? Because human history should take into account the history of the planet, the planetary history. Okay, because how events, natural events and phenomena have influenced human experience or have shaped human experience, that should be taken into account. Otherwise, we would make an error because the blunder was made by, I think, Enlightenment modernity. The blunder was made by with this disjunction between nature and culture, subject and object. This ontological disjunction actually caused the blunder. Culture is always posited against nature, and vice versa. Okay, so therefore this disjunction, or these two categories do not have any separate identity, right? We should take, these two things together. So this is the difference, human history and climate history. So monsters are hybrid, yes, and we must understand ontology not in terms of maker and made, subject and object, as you have mentioned. Thank you, sir. Priyanka, I'm very happy that my answer made sense to you. Thank you, Priyanka. Another resource sound issues, feedback, very informative. Am I audible to you all?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Sir, I think it is the question session is over. Everybody is satisfied with your answers. So
yes. If there is any question, you can ask me or you can send me by email. Okay. So I would be happy to answer all your questions. Even if you fail to ask here, please send me to my email. Thank you very much. Thank you for this wonderful session.
Okay, yes. Thank you, sir. So dear participants, so we have finished with Shukhanju Das, and one announcement is that this is the end of the session 1, and the session will start from today from 6:30 p.m. Okay, so we have another guest from USA, Dr. Francis Francisco Fernando is the leading voice in the field of post-human studies. I think you all know him. Dr. Fernando teaches philosophy at New York University. Okay, so she will deliver his a lecture. So we'll meet again at 6:30. So now I'm hand over the session to Mr. Bapin Mollik to for delivering the vote of thanks. Okay, Bapin Mollik.
Thank you, Jayantoda. So it is now the time for proposing vote of thanks. But before going to the section vote of thanks, I would like to introduce Professor Nilma Silvamoni. This is because due to some technical error, we were not in the position to introduce Professor Silvamoni. So let me introduce Professor Silvamoni. Professor Silvamoni is the former professor and head of the Department of English Studies and Dean, School of Social Sciences and Humanities, Central University of Tamil Nadu. His major research areas are alternative Tenai society, Tenai studies, Tolkapiam, oldest grammatical treatise, eco criticism, poetics and theory. He pioneered the Tenai social movement from late 1970s through a discussion group, Tenai, street theatre, musical performance, and also through the first ever Tenai-based courses, Tamil poetics, later eco-literature, and Tamil musicology in the Indian university system. The forum, now known as Tenai, formerly OSLE India, the first ever journal, Indian Journal of Eco Criticism in India, to promote eco criticism, and numerous lectures, seminars, publication on Tenai and Tenai related matters. Silvamoni's course, Tamil Poetics of early 1970s and the 1980s, introduced eco criticism in Indian academia. He is the first to develop a new area of study known as South Indian eco-musicology in the early 1990s. Professor Silvamoni revived in the 1980s the tradition of Tenai philosophy, which precedes the Darshanas, and formulated a theory of Neo Tenai poetics, formerly Oiki poetics, widely used by scholars all over the world. He has played the guitar professionally and scripted and directed plays as well as composed music for plays. Now I am going to propose the vote of thanks. So, being the convener of today's international webinar on post-COVID-19 environmentalism, possible futures, organized by the Department of English, Department of Political Science, and the Internal Quality Assurance Cell, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar College, Betai, Nodia, it is my privilege to propose the vote of thanks. I express my sincere thanks to Dr. Sudeb Pratim Boshu, Associate Professor, Department of English, Vishwabharati, Shantiniketan, for delivering such wonderful lecture. And at the same time, I would like to thank Mr. Shukhendu Das, Assistant Professor, Department of English and Cultural Studies, Bankura University, West Bengal, India, for delivering such well-researched paper. And at the same time, I would like to extend my thanks to all the research scholars, academicians who have showed their patience to this webinar. And last but not least, I would like to thank Google for creating this kind of space like Google Meet to continue to organize such kind of academic activities. Thank you all. Thank you, and we are meeting you soon at 6:30, and we have with us Professor Francisco Fernando, and the major discussion will be on her book Philosophical Post-Humanism, and we hope that you will join definitely. So thank you once again.